A lot of people who already own one of the Mac Minis have been asking me if they should buy one of these. No, this isn't the 6000 M1 Ultra Mac Studio that the whole YouTube world has gone ultra crazy about. It is the entry-level model because, well, number A, we don't all have $6,000 to slap down onto a pro-level Mac like the big YouTubers. And number B, most of us probably couldn't actually use all of the M1 Ultra chip, even if we tried like really, really hard. So if you already own or are thinking of owning a Mac Mini or a Mac Studio, then watch this first, because in this video, we're going to answer the selfish and ultimate question of, am I going to upgrade my own Mac Mini to the Studio? So I'm going to be covering off everything from power consumption and noise, and of course how fast it is. And then I'll let you know what is actually wrong with this Mac Studio and whether I can really replace all of this on my desk and replace 8 separate components for just a Mac Studio and the Studio Display. So right off the bat, the M1 Mac Mini I'm using is the base model with the upgraded 16GB of memory and 2TB of storage, so total cost $1,699. To compare, we've got the base model Mac Studio, that's the M1 Max with 32GB of memory and 2TB of storage, so that's around $2,999. Basically, it's £1,000 more expensive than the M1 Mac Mini. But to make it a more fair comparison, or rather a more like-for-like comparison, I also have a CalDigit dock plus a 10GB Ethernet adapter, which then adds a further £420-ish to the price, which then brings the M1 Mac Mini to $2,199, so it's only around about £880 difference. For power consumption, when these machines idle, they run about the same, 17 to 20 watts or so, and also when they're in sleep, they both run the same at around about 3 watts. Now when they run at full speed, this is where they start to break away from each other. So when doing more intensive tasks like exporting a video in Final Cut on the Mac Studio, I saw it reach around 35 watts, still pretty good, and then running benchmark tests, which kind of forces it to max out everything, I saw it hit around 50 watts. Now compare this to the M1 Mac, that was reaching around 25 watts for the video export and then 33 watts for the benchmark. So there is a small difference in terms of power consumption that I found with like day-to-day usage, but generally if you aren't taxing the system much, they'll basically be the same when it comes to power. For noise, we used a noisometer, is that a word? To test how loud these machines got. And I'm expecting some 2016 like MacBook Pro whoosh noises here. So we're going to be using TG Pro here to check and set the fan speeds. And it is worth noting here that when the Mac Studio idles, the fans actually spin above their base fan speeds of 1100 RPM. Here we can see they're idling around about 1300 RPM, which is still pretty quiet. It's registering around 40 decibels, which is basically just the volume of this ambient room. Compare that to the Mac Mini, basically the same, around 40 decibels. Now when they get going to their max though, which we can do here from TG Pro, the Mac Studio does run as high as 3500 RPM, which gives you a very, very loud reading of 70 decibels. And I couldn't actually run the same test on the Mac Mini. I'm not sure if it's just a bug or something, but it just wouldn't let me max the fans out. But over time, I can tell you that the Mac Mini barely gets noisy. So if you really, really are putting the Studio through its paces and it ramps that fan speed up to maximum, then yes, it's going to be quite off-putting if it goes on for any length of time. So hopefully you only get this when you're doing that final export of footage, rather than like on the MacBook Pro I used to have, which would just spin up constantly, like if you're on a Zoom call or just even browsing the web. But like I said, through all of my use of the Mac Mini, I've not heard the fans once. And so far, I'm yet to hear them on the Studio, other than when doing these types of tests. So next up, let's compare the disk speed on these machines. And on the M1 Mac Mini, we're seeing read at around 2300 megaseconds and write at 2800 megaseconds, compared to the Studio, which is getting read at just over 4000 megabytes a second and write 5500 megabytes a second. That is something I didn't even think would be faster, but damn, it's double as fast as the Mac Mini. And I guess that's just another reminder that if you are editing large files like video footage or audio footage, then it is always best to work off the local storage instead of internal drives. That's insanely fast. Wow. Now let's touch on connectivity, because there is a new set of I/O with the Mac Studio compared to the Mac Mini. So with the Studio, you get an additional 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB-Cs on the front, plus also that built-in SD card slot. Now for me, this means I no longer need a separate CalDigit dock, which is an extra £270 to £350 on the purchase price, depending on whether you buy the latest model or not. But you might still need something like a dock or a USB hub to be able to connect all of your devices, depending on your use. But for me, it is good and does mean that I can have less stuff on my desk with all these docks and everything. So overall feelings about connectivity is good. I'm really happy to finally have the extra ports, finally have an SD card slot built in. And something else I will mention with the Mac Studio is that with the M1 Mac Mini, it was plagued with all these like Bluetooth issues when anything was connected into the USB ports directly on the Mac. But I'm glad to say that there are no issues that I've seen so far on the Mac Studio. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested in these new Studio displays, I am going to be making a separate video where I put this up against my 49-inch ultra-wide screen and just see how it compares and see if it can replace my screen, my webcam, my speakers, my audio interface, and the microphone to completely reduce all that like desktop clutter even further. So yeah, if you're interested in that, then do subscribe to the channel down below and do the notification thing so you get notified when I post that in the next week or so. Okay, so over to benchmarks now. Let's see how these compare on similar tasks. And let's do the Final Cut export speeds first. So like I said, this is one that people can actually relate to. We all know the M1 Ultra is good as the $20,000 or pound Mac Pro, but we don't all have 20 grand for a Mac Pro or even 6 grand for the Ultra model. I just want to know if by spending an extra 800 or so on the M1 Max Studio, M1 Max Studio, that's a mouthful, will it export my footage quicker? So I am shooting on the Sony a7S III at a fairly high quality, but I never really run into any issues editing on my M1 Mac Mini anyway. But once you start layering up with transitions and graphics and color grades, then it can start to slightly bog down the system, but you don't get that at all on the M1 Max. And when it comes to exporting, we've got the same project on both machines. It's 4.5 minutes long with a selection of footage from the Sony a7S III, graphics, B-roll, screen recordings, color grading, all that good stuff. And they came in at 2 minutes 33 for the Mac Mini and 1 minute 22 for the Studio, and that's the base M1 Max chip, so it's almost twice as fast as the M1 Mac Mini chip. Now that is quite a big difference, particularly if you're working on and regularly working on large project files, and this was only a 4.5 minute project file itself. But with that said, now let's look at Logic Pro and the audio side of things. So the benchmark we're running here is in Logic Pro, and it basically, I found it online, runs multiple tracks to see how many it can play simultaneously. Over on the M1 Mac Mini, we are at 60 tracks. However, on the Mac Studio, we are more than double that, over 159 tracks. Now, if you are an audio editor or need a ton of power to do multi-track audio, then definitely the Mac Studio is the obvious choice here to consider. And actually, for a small bump in price to get more than double the tracks, that's not bad. Now, where things do start to go a bit wrong for me with the Mac Studio is that it is 2022 and both the Mac Mini and the Mac Studio still come with only an HDMI 2.0 ports, which basically means there's no fast refresh rates. And I get why, because these machines are for studio use, and a studio would typically connect to a bigger TV via HDMI to then review their work, and they wouldn't just need 120 Hz on that TV. Now you can see this across all of the Apple marketing, where you can see that people are watching playback on a bigger TV and then come back to the Mac Studio where they start editing. And this is because most movies that you watch are shot in 24 frames per second, and loads of YouTube content will also be 24, 30, or at most 60 frames per second. But even so, it still wouldn't be that difficult just to give us 2.1 and free up another Thunderbolt 4 port on the back. It's not as if these machines aren't powerful enough to cope, right? So yes, the Mac Studio is definitely an upgrade on the Mac Mini. That's pretty much a given. For me, well, I can actually ditch my CalDigit dock and the 10 gig Ethernet adapter, which all saves a mess of wires and cables on my desk, saves some costs overall if you're buying this new. And if I was to swap out that 49-inch ultra-wide for 2 of these displays with the built-in cameras, the mic, the speakers, then actually I could ditch the audio interface, the mic, webcam, speakers. So that video will be coming very, very soon. So the question, and let me know down in the comments below, is whether you think those differences are worth the increased price for the Mac Studio over the M1 Mac Mini. It's almost £900 more expensive for the Studio, which doubles this like non-professionals export times in Final Cut Pro, more than doubles the number of tracks in Logic Pro, and possibly just less clutter on your desk too. Now, something I like doing when switching machines is to start fresh and not restore from a backup, so I just start with a clean slate each time. And so if you are currently thinking of switching computers, do consider using a proper password manager to help you actually easily switch and sign into the apps on each of those machines. So why not go and see who I crown as the best password manager of 2022, and I'll see you there. Cheers.